On the 29th of October 1966, something amazing happened. The one and only Dr. William Hartnell collapsed to the floor and in a blaze of light, transformed into Patrick Troughton. 1 week later, audiences were introduced to this new Doctor in the 6-part story The Power of the Daleks, and a new tradition was born.
As fans, I think we take for granted just what a genius conceit Regeneration is. No other show has tried something like this, and it's the very reason Doctor Who is still running.
Every few years, the show and its main character are completely reinvented, and a new generation of viewers get to fall in love with the Doctor. And since we've just met the 15th Doctor in the form of Ncuti Gatwa, I thought it'd be interesting to look back at how each incarnation was introduced. What are the rituals of regeneration? How well do these stories sell the idea of a new actor playing the role? And ultimately, which is the best Doctor debut?
First, a few ground rules. I'm not strictly talking about post-regeneration stories, as fans tend to call them, just the introductory episodes for each mainline Doctor.
So I will be discussing An Unearthly Child, since it is the overall introduction to the Doctor's character, and The Star Beast, since while it doesn't introduce David Tennant in the role, it is the first regular appearance of the 14th Doctor. I'm also only looking at TV stories, so the War Doctor audio drama Light the Flame and the comic Liberation of the Daleks won't be discussed here. Lastly, due to the length of this script, I've decided to split this retrospective into 2 parts. Today I'll look at the first appearances of the classic Doctors before turning to the modern series in my next video.
I'll be assessing how well these 15 stories introduce the new Doctor, how accessible they are to new viewers, and how they held up as stories in their own right. Without further ado, let's go back to the beginning. It probably goes without saying that Doctor Who's very first episode is just magical to watch.
I watched it recently with a friend who'd never seen it, and seeing her excitement and wonder at the first sight of the TARDIS, the reveal of the console room, and the Doctor's first moments on screen just made me fall in love with this show all over again. It really feels like you're watching the beginning of a legend, but it's still a great simple mystery story that spirals into a Stone Age drama. Ian and Barbara are the first characters to play the audience surrogate role, and are essentially our protagonists in the early stories, with the Doctor and Susan being more mysterious and unpredictable. And while following their student home from school is a safeguarding nightmare, it's a great setup for a pilot episode that very organically transitions into science fiction with the introduction of the TARDIS, which Susan apparently named?
I don't understand you, Susan. Well, I made up the name TARDIS from the initials, time and relative dimension in space.
But what about the Doctor? When Hartnell first enters the scene, he's a strange and slightly scary figure. The unaired pilot leans more into this, making him much more antagonistic and frankly just mean. But recognizing this, the televised episode paints him as more mischievous. He's just messing with Ian and Barbara, and Hartnell plays these moments with such a cheekiness and dry wit that immediately makes him endearing. There are some genuinely funny moments between him and the teachers as he casually patronizes them with his advanced scientific knowledge.
You're treating us like children.
Am I? The children of my civilization would be insulted.
He's definitely not the character we've come to know. He's not even referred to as the Doctor until part 3, and that's to be expected since this is basically his origin story. But there's a twinkle in Hartnell's eye that makes it clear the hero we know and love is still in there.
A lot of fans don't care for the other 3 episodes, and I used to be one of them. I found the first one really engaging as a kid, and then just lost interest in all the caveman stuff.
But revisiting this story years later, I think the Stone Age material is much more effective than fans give it credit for. It never reaches the highs of the first installment, but the atmosphere is great, the conflict with the tribe is intense and quite violent at times, and watching this first ever TARDIS team slowly learn to work together is really engaging. I think there are even some interesting political ideas here, with the discovery of fire being seen as a sign of leadership. Ian tells the tribe that among his people, the Firemaker is the least important person, since everyone can make it. I've seen some fans read socialist themes into this subplot, and it makes for interesting viewing. 3 sets of people from 3 different periods comparing their science and culture. Ian takes the lead here, but the Doctor is still showing early signs of heroism, with the moment where he tricks Cal into revealing himself as a murderer. The cast settle into their roles quickly, and it's easy to see why this original TARDIS team was such a hit.
As an introduction to the Doctor, it works well, but largely because it's the beginning of the character.
Hartnell's Doctor, as presented in this story, is much more stubborn and selfish than the version we see even just a season later, and that's why it's so effective. We begin with a Doctor who doesn't trust people and is a bit of a trickster who gradually evolves into a selfless, heroic figure throughout his first life. It's seeing the man he was compared to the man he becomes that makes this story so rewarding to watch 60 years later.
As a jumping on point, well, the show's still here, so obviously it worked, but I'm not sure I'd suggest it as an entry point for fans in 2024.
It would be fascinating to watch Doctor Who from beginning to end in order, but that's probably not the best approach as a first-time viewer. I imagine most people watching An Unearthly Child today are already fans who want to see the show's very first story, and it works on that level. It's a bit slow in places which may put some modern viewers off, and it's definitely a story that peaks early, but I still find it an engaging, well-constructed serial and essential viewing for any sci-fi fan. And I would urge fans who haven't seen it to check it out, but the actions of a very petty and bigoted individual have made this key part of Doctor Who mythology much harder to find. It's the only surviving serial not available on iPlayer, ITVX or BritBox, so unless you can find a torrent online or something, I'd recommend picking up the beginning box set, which includes the first 3 stories and some cool bonus features. It's the beginning of one of television's greatest legends, and still a rewarding watch 6 decades later. 3 years later, the Doctor's body has started wearing thin, leading to the show's first ever post-regeneration story, The Power of the Daleks. Sadly, Patrick Troughton's debut suffered the same fate as many stories from this time, being either junked or sold by the BBC, becoming one of the infamous missing episodes. For me, if any missing story could be recovered, it would be this one, if only because of its importance to the show's history as the first introduction to a new Doctor.
Since I literally can't watch the real story, I instead watched the 2016 animated version, which I'll be using for visuals in this section.
As an introduction to regeneration, it's not crystal clear what's happened to the Doctor. The description he gives of the process is quite different from the concept we've come to know a dozen regenerations later. He simply claims to have been renewed by the TARDIS, implying this is an artificial phenomenon rather than a Time Lord ability, and his clothes have changed with him, which is just as confusing as it was in 2022. The new Doctor is a bit of a quiet schemer, rarely giving straight answers and seems to enjoy confusing his companions Ben and Polly. David Whittaker's script cleverly uses their characters to reflect how divided the viewers would be by the Doctor's sudden change. Polly sort of gets it immediately, while Ben isn't convinced and remains skeptical until a Dalek confirms the Doctor's identity. Viewers in 1966 were probably feeling the same way, confused, frustrated, and maybe even a little sad at the loss of Hartnell's character. So representing this polarization within the show itself was a smart move, keeping the companions as a source of familiarity to ease viewers through the transition. Speaking of the new Doctor, I can't fully judge Patrick Troughton's first performance since so little footage of it survives, but I love this characterization. A trickster playing the fool while also being more personable than his predecessor. He's fascinating to watch as he casually brushes off his renewal, confronts the Daleks, and plays mind games with the people in the colony. By the halfway point, you're pretty at ease with Troughton as the Doctor, with the rest of the story continuing as any Doctor Who story would. The Daleks are the real stars of the show here, and this is one of their best outings yet. Posing as humble servants to the people of Vulcan, they don't even speak for a long time and are especially eerie with their blank, unreadable stares.
They can never truly be as scary as they were to viewers in the 60s because of how absorbed they've become by popular culture, but there is something quite creepy about them here.
In the same way that HAL 9000 is creepy, there's nothing human to read, all you have is a largely monotone voice and an unblinking eye. When they do speak, we not only get some great iconic sequences, but also some genuinely funny moments where their mask begins to slip.
You know, it's amazing. You have an almost human interest and curiosity.
A Dalek is not the same as a human.
That bit really cracked me up on this rewatch.
They're a formidable threat, and with Dalek Mania still fresh in audiences' minds, having them return to usher in the new Doctor was a genius move, and I think it's especially important that they recognise him, cementing them as an enemy throughout all the Doctor's lives. But a returning monster begs the question of whether Power of the Daleks can still be enjoyed as an entry point to the series. By nature of it being the first post-regeneration episode, it does require some background knowledge for context. But since Ben and Polly are not only new to regeneration but are also strangers to the Daleks, they work well as audience surrogates, until Polly disappears in the middle. And at this point, the Daleks and regeneration are so widely known that someone watching this in 2024 could probably still follow it. In terms of selling the viewer on this new Doctor, Troughton's stranger, sillier, but just as heroic incarnation manages to win you over very quickly. The hand-waving away of renewal allows the character and the narrative to just move along, not dragging the story down at all. And maybe that's why Power of the Daleks is such a good Doctor debut. It's a great story that just so happens to introduce a new Doctor. A new Doctor for a new decade, Spearhead from Space is the biggest stylistic shake-up the show had had. Gone were the monochrome alien worlds, and in came the dazzling Technicolor, grounded invasion stories, and Fleetwood Mac?
Even when I knew it was coming, hearing Fleetwood Mac in Doctor Who always takes me off guard.
It's arguably the first attempt to completely relaunch Doctor Who, with only the TARDIS, UNIT and the Brigadier continuing into this new status quo. And even then, the Brig is introduced in such a way that seeing his previous appearances isn't required.
In fact, I only checked out his first appearance in the Web of Fear during the research for this video. Yes, I'm a fake fan.
But all around, everything feels new, making Spearhead a great jumping on point and a great place to begin dipping your toes into the classic series. Among these new things are the Autons and the Nestene Consciousness, which are such great monsters. It's the classic take something ordinary and make it scary formula that the best Doctor Who aliens follow, and they're especially creepy here with those blank eyes and the cold performances of the Autoplastics crew under their control. In many ways, this is the first proper post-regeneration story, in the sense that it lays down the blueprint that future stories would continue to follow. The Doctor staying in bed for episode 1, a bit of slapstick hijinks, and even the Doctor stealing clothes from a hospital, which becomes something of a running gag in future episodes. The regeneration process is still kept vague, and it takes the Brigadier some time to come to terms with the idea that this erratic, action-oriented man is the same person he met in the 60s. Possibly 70s, but I'm not going down that rabbit hole. While he is the main character, we see the Doctor through Liz Shaw's eyes, and she's immediately endearing with how the Doctor quickly takes a liking to her. But let's finally talk about the third Doctor. Jon Pertwee starts as a more aloof and mysterious character, wanting after his shoes, taking showers, nicking clothes, before finding himself and becoming a more grounded, protective personality. As a viewer, you feel like he will look after you, and we see that he can hold his own in a fight, something we hadn't really seen from the Doctor up to that point. He's a lot of fun to watch, but you get the sense Jon and the script are still finding their feet with this new incarnation, trying to figure out how he'll talk and behave. But strangely, changing almost everything about the show makes the Doctor's regeneration a little easier to swallow. Even the ending, setting up the idea of the TARDIS being stranded and the Doctor's new position at UNIT, establishes that this will be a very different Doctor Who than what viewers have come to expect. When I began writing this section, I felt a little underwhelmed revisiting this story, finding it a lot slower than I remembered. It was only when I started collecting footage for this video that I realised what a well-constructed story this is, with each individual episode having a standout moment. It's well paced with just 4 episodes and plenty of action, and it's a fairly simple story, which might have been a result of the production team looking back at the last 2 Doctor debuts with their more complex narratives and ensembles, and looking to usher in this era with a more straightforward invasion story.
I'm a bit behind on the Troughton and Pertwee years, so this transition doesn't hit me as hard as it might have done. Yes, I'm still a fake fan.
But overall, with a great new monster, minimal ties to the show's past, and the beginning of an intriguing new status quo for the series, Spearhead from Space is an impactful debut for Pertwee's Doctor. With regeneration finally given a name and a full explanation in Planet of the Spiders, the 4th Doctor emerges in the form of Tom Baker, the actor who nearly 50 years on is still considered by many the definitive portrayal of the character.
Before getting into the story itself, I have to stress, as cliche as it is to say, it is astonishing how quickly Tom settles into the role.
When I showed Robot to my sister when I finally got hold of the Season 12 Blu-ray, we turned to each other less than halfway through Part 1 and agreed on how instantly perfect Tom is. This restless, wild-eyed bohemian just bursts onto the screen and plays it like the part was his to begin with.
And maybe that was the key to Tom's success. He played the part as though no one had played it before him, and yet retained all the great characteristics of the previous Doctors.
He has the unpredictability of Hartnell, but retains that protective quality Pertwee brought, while also having comic timing on par with Troughton, and that booming voice allowing him to instantly own every room he's in. He just arrives fully formed with all of his quirks and eccentricities there from the beginning. The scene where he chooses his costume is given more importance this time, with an extended comedy montage, and I think most effectively, his very first Jelly Baby scene is used as a way to comfort Sarah after the robot is destroyed, reassuring both her and the audience that despite his quirks, this new Doctor will always keep her safe. Rather than introducing a new tone for the show, this story is almost a send-off to the unit era, with the organisation only returning for a handful of appearances in Tom's run. It still feels like a continuation, and I like that the cast isn't given a chance to rest or adapt to the Doctor's regeneration. The plot just keeps moving, and as soon as he's picked a costume, the Doctor just carries on business as usual. We'd seen the Doctor being restless after regenerating before, but here it's established as just part of his new personality.
Is it a hot take to say that I prefer the Brigadier with the 4th Doctor than the 3rd? I just think his madcap personality's a funnier contrast.
Sarah Jane, played by Elizabeth Sladen, witnesses this regeneration, and yeah, she's still wonderful. She holds her own against UNIT and the think tank, even delivering a great jab against their conspiracies.
Well, we're covering a number of fringe organisations, and I'm sure we'll find a place for you. Somewhere between the Flying Saucer People and the Flat Earthers.
And she forms a sweet King Kong-esque bond with the K-1 robot. The titular robot is a great costume design and has deservedly remained an iconic image from this era. The plot is another simple one, but still very engaging, with themes of extremism, the dangers of science, and even what it means to be human, all the while being a fun blockbuster romp. With its fully formed characterization of the Doctor, great cast, and entertaining sci-fi narrative, I think Robot is a solid introduction to the Tom Baker era. Although it picks up immediately where the previous story left off and follows characters from the previous era, except Harry, who makes his first appearance here, it successfully reintroduces the show using familiar elements and a bold, wonderful new lead actor. A great start to the most iconic Doctor of the classic series. After an unprecedented 7-year run, Tom Baker finally bowed out after saving the universe one last time from the Master. And so Peter Davison was the Doctor, even starting this cover tradition for Doctor Who magazine. Just don't look too closely at that cover text.
They misspelt my name, Jeremy.
This story concludes a loose Master trilogy, starting with Tom's penultimate and final stories, The Keeper of Traken and Legopolis. This doesn't overly hurt the story as a jumping on point, since the 3 chapters only share a villain and the loose thread of introducing Tegan and Nyssa. If you joined here, it wouldn't hurt to check out the last 2 stories for context, since the characters aren't given a clear introduction for anyone who missed the rest of this mini arc. Arguably, introducing the new TARDIS team at the end of the previous season frees Castrovalva of the baggage of assembling the new cast of characters. With the regeneration process better fleshed out in recent years, Castrovalva makes the Doctor's change a vocal point of the first 2 parts, expanding the mythology with the idea of post-regenerative trauma and the introduction of the Zero Room. Peter Davison does a great job with this more uncertain Doctor, and I especially like the scene where he impersonates his previous selves as he settles into his new body. It's a fun way to break the ice with the new Doctor, and you can just tell Peter was a huge Patrick Troughton fanboy, since that's the impression he relishes in the most.
Oh dear. We've wandered into the wrong corridor. We must be close to the main TARDIS drive now.
Even selecting a costume is treated with more importance than in previous stories, with the 5th Doctor literally unknitting the 4th's famous scarf, and the music paints the scene where he finds the cricket gear as a pivotal moment, like the beginning of this Doctor's journey. By the end of part 3, Peter feels nicely settled into the role, playing the Doctor as a fresh-faced hero who can't quite command the room like his predecessor.
And that's not a criticism, it's part of his character. An optimistic hero desperately trying to find peace in a universe constantly presenting him with the opposite.
This more tragic element of his character isn't really in Castrovalva, but you do get a good sense of what to expect from Peter's Doctor, making this a pretty well-rounded debut performance. Christopher H. Bidmead's script has a quaint charm to it, nicely setting the story apart from the more somber tones at the end of the 4th Doctor era, while also nicely reflecting the environment of Castrovalva itself, which is a fascinating setting. Unfortunately, the companions feel a little like spare parts here, with Adric being kidnapped and Nyssa and Tegan left to literally carry a sleeping Doctor through a forest. When we get to the titular planet, we get some great imagery, but to be honest, I found myself losing interest in the conflict there. The Master's up to his old tricks and disguises again, and I like how the people of the city turn on him, but he's mainly there just to provide some more conflict to a mostly pretty chill story.
While it doesn't reach the highs of Power of the Daleks or Robot, I still find Castrovalva an easy and fun watch.
The 5th Doctor makes an impact, the effects are a lot of fun, and although I'm not sure how well it fares as a jumping on point, the charm of the script and Peter Davison's performance makes this a bright, optimistic start to the new era.
Okay, this story requires a bit of context.
Usually, the first story for a new Doctor kicks off a whole new season, and this makes sense. It's a big draw and allows for a clean slate so the new actor can spread their wings over the following weeks. But producer John Nathan Turner felt that fans shouldn't have to wait a year to see the new guy in action, so moved Colin Baker's premiere story to the end of season 21, 1 week after Peter Davison's finale.
This was an interesting move, and I can see the logic behind it if the previous story wasn't the case of Androzani.
See, the Fifth Doctor's final story is widely considered one of the greatest Doctor Who stories of all time. In fact, in 2009 it was voted the best in Doctor Who magazine's poll of every story up to that point, and still ranks high in the countdowns to this day. Now take a guess where the following story fell in that ranking. That's right, the exact opposite spot. Imagine the whiplash of watching these two stories just weeks apart in 1984.
Everything's turned from gold.
I've never watched The Twin Dilemma immediately after Caves, which is a luxury the audience in 1984 didn't get.
Viewing this story on its own merits as an introduction to the 6th Doctor, it's just not good.
Obviously this is subjective and it feels almost mean to pick on it because I love Colin Baker. I think we all do, he's such a wonderful ambassador for the show, and with how poorly he was treated by the BBC at the time, he has every right to be bitter, and yet has remained a great positive voice in the fandom and is so proud to be part of the show's history. But this is such a boring, misjudged opening story. In contrast with the hopeful and affable 5th Doctor, the 6th is a trickier, more cynical character. This era liked to push the idea of the Doctor being an alien further with its fashion sense, mood swings and unpredictable nature. The idea supposedly being to present a hero's journey for him, beginning as the most violent and self-centered version of himself before growing into a selfless hero. But the polarized reaction from viewers forced the series to speed up this character arc, making the 6th Doctor we see in his second season much more endearing and honestly more fun to watch. I think it's in The Trial of a Time Lord where we see Colin really shine, and I just wish we could have got this version of him from the beginning, because although he excels at the theatricality and the arrogance, the Doctor in The Twin Dilemma is just mean-spirited and kind of annoying. The idea of a regeneration going wrong is introduced here, with the Doctor trying to kill Peri, as well as suffering several violent outbursts. Peri even calls him manic-depressive at one point, and although that terminology is a bit outdated, she's not far off. Even going into this story knowing all the infamous parts, his behaviour is just confusing and not in an entertaining way, giving the story a strange, cynical tone that's distractingly offset by the silly costume design and narrative. The Twin Dilemma's biggest crime for me is just being dull. The conflict isn't engaging, the pacing is poor, and even at just 4 parts, it feels slower than some 6-parters. I think this is because the two major plotlines of a new, potentially dangerous Doctor and some evil slug using 2 boy geniuses for world domination have no real connection to each other. Colin's era does this a lot, where the first half shows the story of the week unfolding alongside cutaways in the TARDIS, and I can't say I'm a fan of that approach. It just slows down the pacing and makes for quite a disjointed first half. So is there any good here? Well, I think the cast do a decent job elevating this material, with Nicola Bryant really being put through the ringer here. Her friend has just changed into a melodramatic weirdo, she thinks he's dead at one point, and she's constantly being harassed for the next season. Her loyalty to the Doctor throughout all of this makes her more likeable, but you do just want her to leave him at some point. Their more playful, cheeky friendship in the Mysterious Planet is a long way away, leading to quite a heated TARDIS team. Kevin McNally is fine in a largely unnecessary role, and Maurice Denham gives a surprisingly touching performance as the Doctor's old friend and mentor, Asmael. And there are moments where this new characterization for the Doctor really works. I believe his friendship with Asmael, the moment where he casually claims to be able to crack millions of lock combinations is classic 6, and even the final moments of this story are elevated by Colin's performance. He famously proclaims,
I am the Doctor, whether you like it or not.
Which isn't exactly something that would win over your audience, but what I never see talked about is what happens after. The Doctor gives Peri a little reassuring smile, as if he's saying, I know this is weird, but we'll figure it out together. It's a really sweet moment that I think the story needed more of, which highlights the key issue with the Twin Dilemma. It's a poor script, slightly improved by the performances. If more of Colin's real personality was allowed to shine through, the early 6th Doctor would be much more entertaining.
If not the worst Doctor Who story of all time, The Twin Dilemma is certainly the most infamous, and for that reason it's almost worth checking out just to watch all these weird creative decisions play out in context.
Colin Baker later flourishes into a more well-rounded and interesting Doctor, with his second season and by being further fleshed out in Big Finish's audio dramas. And there are certainly early signs here that Colin does understand the character and has the right theatrical presence to own the role. But with an uninvolving story and an inconsistent, mean-spirited tone, this was not the beginning the Sixth Doctor deserved. But this scene is hilarious.
Villain!
Following the disappointing reception to Colin Baker's second season, delayed by an 18-month hiatus by BBC controller Michael Grade, producer John Nathan Turner was told that a new season of Doctor Who would happen on the condition that Baker was replaced.
John decided to break this news to Colin respectfully, over telephone, and Colin, understandably angry, refused to come back for a final story or even a regeneration scene.
Side note here, when I saw Colin Baker at a panel in Scarborough last November, he claimed that the latter decision was because he'd already agreed to do a play around the same time, so he couldn't come back to regenerate even if he wanted to. Just thought I should mention that. And so the 1987 season opener, Time of the Rani, introduced a brand new Doctor in the form of Radagast the Brown himself, Sylvester McCoy. Time of the Rani doubles as both a regeneration and post-regeneration story, since the Sixth Doctor's death opens the first episode, although he's still played by McCoy. And here's a funny detail: since it's never explained what triggered the regeneration and the exercise bike that Mel forced the Doctor to use in Terror of the Vervoids is in frame, fans assumed for years that the Sixth Doctor died from falling off and hitting his head on the console.
I fell off an exercise bike. Is that how I went?
Thankfully, Colin finally got a proper, dignified regeneration scene in the 2015 Big Finish release, The Brink of Death.
But what about the story itself?
Tonally, this is a breath of fresh air after the mean-spirited tone of much of Colin's era. The Rani makes her first and, so far, only return to the series, as she kidnaps various geniuses throughout the universe to build a time manipulator to rewrite history, including Oppenheimer's own Albert Einstein. I know Einstein probably deserves his own dedicated historical story, but I kinda love that he's just there and the story carries on as normal. To trick the Doctor, the Rani disguises herself as Mel Bush, and does a surprisingly decent Bonnie Langford.
Perhaps the machine exploding affected my memory too. Doctor, what were the readings?
All that gives you the vibe of what this story is like. It's weird and pantomime and definitely not for everyone, but I found it refreshing to have an opening adventure that captures the silly fun that Doctor Who can indulge in. It's almost a hodgepodge of different classic Who cliches, from the quarry planet, the silly costumes, and the distinctly 80s music and effects. Despite this, I found the story quite slow on this rewatch, and I don't think it holds up particularly well to repeat viewings unless you're really in the mood for a bit of campy sci-fi. But what about the main man himself? Although the more layered characterization of the Seventh Doctor as a manipulative mastermind is developed much later in his run, I still quite like Sylve's early performances. This Chaplin-esque madcap scientist leaps onto the screen and completely gets the material. He has great chemistry with Bonnie. I love how his post-regenerative trauma is played more for comedy than the melodrama of the previous story, and by the end you want to see more of him. Speaking of Bonnie, Mel is, well, Mel. She seems to be a bit of a Marmite character among fans, but since she's returned in the current era, this computer scientist and fitness obsessive has had a bit of a reassessment. She's definitely a more capable character than she's given credit for, but her best material is when she finally reunites with the Doctor. She perfectly matches the vibe of this story, and honestly, I'm happy to see her back in 2024. As an introduction to the show, it's more mixed. There's no real explanation for who the Doctor is, and even with the amnesia plot point, the script still assumes the audience knows about Mel and the Rani without a refresher. But as an opener to season 24, this sets the tone perfectly. Colourful, silly, and a bit mad, that's pretty much the early 7th Doctor era. But in almost an inverse of what happened with Colin, the 7th Doctor begins as a comedic figure and suddenly becomes a scheming mastermind. So in the context of who this character becomes, Time of the Rani isn't the best representation of McCoy's Doctor. It's fun, and there's certainly a charm to it, but I didn't find myself as involved as I was when I first watched it.
And for nearly a decade, that was the last time we were introduced to the Doctor, since in 1989, Doctor Who came to an abrupt end.
There were rumours of a new series, a Hollywood movie, and even an actor who randomly claimed to be the new Doctor starring in a couple of pilot episodes, but there's no record of them existing, so let's be honest, he probably lied. But there was one man in particular who was determined to resurrect the show, Philip Segal, a producer for Steven Spielberg's own Amblin Entertainment.
And the early 90s saw several rejected scripts, casting sessions, and constant arguments between British and American producers until eventually, one night only, the Doctor was back. And it was about time.
The Eighth Doctor's first and only full on-screen adventure is a bit of an oddity in Doctor Who history. Despite clearly being a continuation of the classic series, it was also intended as a backdoor pilot for an eventual revival, so makes many changes to the lore and has a distinctly different look and feel. Stylistically, it's always reminded me of the X-Files, especially since it's mostly set at night in a big American city. Plus, the dynamic of a skeptical redhead and an eccentric believer in the impossible feels a bit familiar. But it also has some surprisingly deep cuts into the lore, with the Eye of Harmony and the 12 Regeneration Rule being pivotal to the film's narrative. It's often criticised for overloading new audiences with continuity, and while the opening moments certainly suffer from this, and a few references later that feel like the filmmakers picking out fun facts from the show's Wikipedia page, I think making the Regeneration a central plot point was a smart move. Writer Matthew Jacobs explained that he felt that when introducing the Doctor to an American audience, making the Doctor's central journey one of self-discovery would put viewers on a level playing field with the main character.
The story is essentially Doctor Who Am I, allowing the audience to understand the Doctor at the same speed that he comes to understand himself.
This film is carried by Paul McGann. He's just wonderful here, bringing a wide-eyed optimism and youthful energy to the role. I love his random name-dropping of historical figures, his Britishisms turned up to 10, and I completely believe this is the same man viewers had followed for over 30 years. Even fans that don't like the movie collectively agree that Paul is great in it, and I would have loved to see this hopeful, passionate Doctor continue in a full series. The Eighth Doctor has changed a lot over the decades through his various Big Finish stories and writers developing his personality further, but that essential optimism and charm are all there from the beginning. Even having Sylvester McCoy return for the regeneration scene feels right. Yes, it's a shame his Doctor didn't get a true finale on screen, but having the Seventh Doctor back to hand over the keys of the TARDIS allowed McGann's Doctor to be a true addition to the lore. He wasn't a rebooted Doctor for the American viewers, he was our Doctor regenerated once again. And producer Philip Segal had to really fight for McCoy to make an appearance. Higher-ups wanted Tom Baker to appear as the Doctor in the film's first act. Well, that would have messed the numbering up to no end. Like Castrovalva before it, the movie pits the new Doctor against a new Master in the form of Eric Roberts, who delivers one of the campiest villain performances in the show's history, and I love it.
I always dress for the occasion.
It's a little hard to reconcile this Bruce Master with his previous incarnations, but he's just right for this big, ridiculous blockbuster premise. I even love that he gets his new body on the same night the Doctor regenerates. It reminds me of how the Green Goblin's origin and Spider-Man's are intercut in the first Spider-Man movie, and that's the sort of tone I think this is going for, with some bold imagery like Grace running through the hospital in an opera dress, the broader visual comedy, and this line that's clearly for the trailer.
This is a movie, and if you allow yourself to go with it, you'll have a great time.
Daphne Ashbrook is a good match for Paul's Doctor, although I'm not sure I buy the romance between them. And Yi Ji-So makes for a decent companion of sorts to the Master, with some pretty funny banter between them. The plot is mostly straightforward, although there is a lot of technobabble that I'm not sure I fully understand in the climax. It's well directed by Jeffrey Sachs with some great imagery, one of the eeriest regeneration scenes in the show's history, and a great soundtrack. As an entry point to Doctor Who, it's a strange one. There's plenty of lore introduced and some of it is well integrated, but there's probably too much of it to grab new viewers. I think the film should really start with Lee finding the TARDIS, establishing the Doctor as a mysterious figure who can cheat death, and saving the reveal of that gorgeous TARDIS set until later. The fact this film never led to a full season means it stands out more as its own entity, which means even if a new fan likes what they see here, they'll struggle to find anything else like it. Since it ends with the Doctor flying away on his own, the expanded universe was basically given a clean slate with McGann's Doctor. The Eighth Doctor fans currently enjoying comics, novels and audio dramas is quite stylistically removed from his origins in this film. Even the half-human thing this film introduced was completely ignored by the series itself, probably because Russell has admitted he doesn't like it. Many saw it as the last shot at a revival for the show. Obviously this didn't go to plan, but now we're nearly 20 years into the actual revival, this story can just be enjoyed on its own merits now there's none of that added weight. It's an entertaining TV movie with a great central performance and plenty of comedy, action and romance to keep you invested.
As an introduction to the show, it's very flawed, but as a different take on the series 30 years into its run, it's a fascinating watch and gifted us with an excellent new Doctor. And that's the end of part 1.
Watching these stories in order has been quite the experience, and I found myself enjoying certain episodes more than I expected and liking some a little less. Watching how the formula for a Doctor debut slowly begins to form across the decades is fascinating, with Spearhead from Space being perhaps the most influential. Hell, Rusty Davies used the same monster from that story to kick off his era of the show.
But there was something I began to realise the further I got into this marathon. I think the serialised nature of the classic series means that the introduction to a new Doctor holds less significance.
It's a big deal, absolutely, but when you have 4 to 6 episodes to introduce your leading man or woman, there's a lot more time to get used to them. These stories often span whole months, so by a certain point, seeing how the new guy performs isn't as relevant, since the usual story of the week must take centre stage. This isn't necessarily a problem or an observation that these debuts are less about selling the audience on the new Doctor, and more about allowing viewers to get used to them, which is a little different to how these stories are handled in the revival. Now, with only an hour to introduce the new actor and often a new feel for the show, the actor's performance becomes the major talking point of the story.
I'll save a full ranking of these episodes until the end of the second part, because like Classic Who, I love a cliffhanger. See you all next time.